Welcome to this journey into one of the darkest corners of American history, where the horrors of the past refuse to stay buried, and where justice, denied in life, may have found its voice in death. Before we begin, I want to know something from you, our community of truth seekers. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from right now, and what time is it where you are? Are you alone in the darkness, or surrounded by the safety of daylight? This matters more than you think when dealing with stories like the one you're about to hear. The year is 1863. The American Civil War has been raging for 2 brutal years, tearing the nation apart at its seams. In the rural heartland of Georgia, far from the major battlefields that would define the conflict in history books, there existed places where the war seemed like a distant rumor, where the old order clung desperately to power, where men like Elijah Crane believed they could hold back the tide of change through sheer cruelty and iron will. The Crane plantation sat isolated among the dense pine forests of central Georgia, approximately 30 miles from any significant town. Historical records from the Wilkinson County archives describe it as a medium-sized operation, not one of the grand estates that dominated the coastal regions, but substantial enough to require the forced labor of 43 souls, 43 human beings whose names were listed in ledgers as property, whose lives were measured in their capacity to produce cotton and tobacco. But this is not a story about the plantation itself. This is a story about what happened in the winter of 1863 during a series of nights that would be remembered, whispered about, and feared for generations to come. This is a story about chains that moved on their own, about screams that came from metal rather than human throats, about a death that no one could explain, and about a man named Samuel who vanished into history, leaving behind only questions and a legacy of terror. On the night of December 14th, 1863, something happened at the Crane plantation that defied all rational explanation. Neighbors reported hearing sounds coming from the property that they described in their testimonies as unholy, as if the very instruments of bondage had found a voice. The local doctor who examined the scene the following morning wrote in his personal journal that what he witnessed challenged everything he understood about the natural world. By dawn on December 15th, Elijah Crane was dead. His body discovered in the basement of the main house under circumstances that remain disputed to this day. And Samuel, the man who had lost everything to Crane's cruelty, had disappeared without a trace, never to be seen again. What happened in that basement? Was it murder, carefully planned and executed by human hands driven by righteous rage? Was it something else entirely, something that emerged from the accumulated suffering soaked into those chains, into the very walls of that cursed place? Or was it, as some believe, a convergence of both, a moment when the boundary between the physical and the supernatural dissolved entirely? The official records are incomplete, deliberately obscured or lost to time, but the stories remained. The testimonies of those who were there, fragmentary and contradictory as they are, paint a picture of events so disturbing that many refuse to speak of them at all. The physical evidence, what little survived, suggests something that shouldn't be possible. This is the story of the chains that screamed at midnight. This is the story of Elijah Crane and Samuel. This is a story about the darkest chapter of American history colliding with something that history cannot fully explain. And I must warn you now, this journey will take us into places where human cruelty and the possibility of supernatural retribution become indistinguishable from one another. We will examine documents that were meant to stay, hidden, testimonies that were dismissed as impossible, and evidence that challenges our understanding of what is real. Stay with me until the very end, because the truth, whatever it may be, lies not in any single revelation, but in the accumulation of details, in the pattern that emerges from the darkness. Let us begin in the months before that terrible night, when Elijah Crane still believed himself untouchable, when Samuel still had reason to hope, and when the chains in that basement were nothing more than instruments of oppression, not yet awakened to their terrible purpose. To understand what happened at the Crane plantation in December of 1863, we must first understand the world in which these events took place, a world that seems almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities, yet whose echoes still reverberate through American society today. Georgia in 1863 was a state in crisis. The Confederate cause, once embraced with fervent enthusiasm in the early days of the war, was beginning to show cracks. Sherman's march to the sea was still a year away, but the writing was on the wall for those who could read it. Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg earlier that year had shifted the momentum of the war. More crucially, President Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, declaring all enslaved people in Confederate states to be free. Of course, a proclamation issued in Washington meant little in the isolated plantations of central Georgia, where Confederate authority still held absolute sway, but word traveled, carried by slaves moved between plantations, by Confederate soldiers returning from the front with tales of Union advances, by the whispered conversations that took place in the slave quarters after dark. The enslaved population knew that change was coming, even if they couldn't know when or how it would arrive. Elijah Crane was 52 years old in 1863, a man who had inherited the plantation from his father. 20 years earlier, unlike some of the more educated plantation owners who at least paid lip service to paternalistic notions of slavery, Crane was known throughout the county as a man of exceptional brutality. Records from the Wilkinson County Courthouse include multiple complaints filed by neighboring plantation owners about Crane's treatment of enslaved people, not out of moral concern, but because his cruelty was considered excessive even by the standards of the time, and threatened to incite unrest. A letter dated March 1862, written by plantation owner Thomas Whitfield to his brother in Savannah, describes Crane in disturbing terms. The letter, preserved in the Georgia Historical Society archives, states, "Elijah Crane has taken to methods that I dare not commit fully to paper. His slaves bear marks that speak to a mind that has crossed from discipline into something darker. I fear what may come of such excess." The plantation itself was a typical structure of its kind. The main house, a two-story colonial building with white columns, sat at the center of the property. Behind it were the various outbuildings, the kitchen house, the smokehouse, the overseer's cottage, and further back, barely visible from the main house, were the slave quarters, a row of rough wooden cabins where the enslaved population lived in conditions of deliberate deprivation. But there was another structure, one that would become central to our story. The main house had a basement, unusual for the region where most buildings were built above ground due to flooding concerns. Crane's father had it constructed specifically for storage, but Elijah Crane had repurposed it for something else entirely. According to testimonies gathered after the events of December 1863, Crane had begun, sometime in early 1863, to chain selected enslaved people in the basement overnight. The stated reason was punishment for perceived infractions, but survivors later suggested it was arbitrary, driven by Crane's increasingly paranoid belief that rebellion was being planned. The chains themselves were documented in an inventory taken after Crane's death. They were industrial shackles, each weighing approximately 15 pounds, designed to secure both ankles and wrists. There were 12 sets in total, bolted directly into the stone walls of the basement. The inventory, conducted by the county sheriff, noted that the chains showed unusual wear patterns and that the basement floor was stained with what was presumed to be blood. Samuel enters the historical record fragmentarily. We know he was approximately 34 years old in 1863. We know he had been brought to the Crane plantation around 1850, purchased from an estate sale in South Carolina. Records indicate he was literate, which was illegal but not uncommon, and that he worked primarily as a skilled carpenter, valuable enough that Crane kept him close. We know that Samuel had a wife, Dinah, and a daughter, Ruth, who was 8 years old. And we know that in August of 1863, both Dinah and Ruth died under circumstances that were never fully documented. The only official record is a single line in Crane's ledger: property loss, natural causes, August 14th. But natural causes was a term that covered a multitude of horrors. Testimonies from survivors, collected decades later by historians and abolitionists, paint a different picture. They speak of a punishment that went too far, of Crane's rage over some small infraction, of deaths that could have been prevented with basic medical care that was deliberately withheld. Samuel changed after August 14th. Multiple sources describe a man who had been relatively even-tempered becoming withdrawn, speaking rarely, spending his nights staring at nothing. One testimony given by a woman named Patience in 1897 describes Samuel during this period. After they took his wife and child, something left Samuel's eyes. He moved like a man already dead, but there was something underneath, something cold and waiting. Throughout the fall of 1863, tensions on the plantation increased. News of the Emancipation Proclamation had fully penetrated the slave quarters by this point. Crane responded by intensifying his control mechanisms. The nightly chaining in the basement became more frequent, sometimes involving a dozen people at once, kept in darkness and cold for 10 or 12 hours at a stretch. November brought the first reports of strange occurrences. An overseer named Jeremiah Holt reported hearing sounds from the basement late at night, describing them in his journal as metal on metal, but with a rhythm that seemed purposeful, almost like speech. When he investigated, he found the chained individuals asleep, the basement silent. Crane himself began to exhibit signs of psychological deterioration. Letters from this period show increasingly erratic handwriting, paranoid accusations against his neighbors, and references to needing to maintain order by any means necessary. One letter, dated November 28, 1863, includes a passage that would later seem prophetic. They seek to break their bonds, but the bonds are stronger than they know. The chains will hold them, body and soul, until I decide otherwise. By early December, the situation had reached a breaking point. Crane had begun keeping Samuel chained in the basement every single night, along with 5 or 6 others on rotation. The stated reason was prevention of escape attempts, but survivors suggested it was personal, that Crane had developed a particular obsession with breaking Samuel's spirit completely. The stage was set. The long winter nights of December 1863 were approaching. In that basement, beneath the grand house where Elijah Crane slept in comfort, 12 sets of chains hung from stone walls, waiting. And something was building, a pressure that could not be contained forever. A reckoning that was about to arrive in a form that no one could have anticipated. The chains would soon find their voice. The first documented incident occurred on the night of December 7, 1863, exactly 1 week before Elijah Crane's death. According to the testimony of Jeremiah Holt, the overseer whose journal provides some of our most detailed contemporary accounts, the evening began normally. 6 individuals were chained in the basement that night. Samuel, a man named Isaac, 2 brothers named Thomas and Daniel, and 2 women, Clara and Abigail. They were secured to the walls at approximately 8 in the evening, a process Holt describes with clinical detachment in his journal. The procedure was routine, Holt wrote. Each was secured with both ankle and wrist restraints. The chains were tested for strength. The basement door was locked from the outside. Mr. Crane retired to his study. I returned to my quarters approximately 200 yards from the main house. At approximately midnight, something changed. Holt's journal entry for December 7th contains a passage that he would later underline multiple times. "I was awakened by a sound unlike anything I have heard in my 40 years. It came from the direction of the main house, a metallic screaming, as if iron itself had found a voice. The sound was rhythmic, almost musical, but wrong in a way I cannot adequately describe. It lasted for perhaps 3 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun." Holt immediately went to investigate, bringing a lantern and a firearm. He found the main house, dark, Crane apparently still asleep on the upper floor. When Holt unlocked the basement door and descended, he found all 6 chained individuals apparently asleep, their restraints secure, everything appearing normal. Yet the stone walls were cold to the touch despite the mild night, and Holt noted in his journal that the air in the basement had a quality of disturbance, as after a great commotion, though nothing appeared disturbed. He attributed the sound to his imagination, to a dream, perhaps, and returned to his quarters. But 2 nights later, on December 9th, it happened again, and this time he was not alone in hearing it. A neighboring plantation owner, Marcus Weatherby, whose property bordered the Crane estate, documented the incident in a letter to his cousin in Macon dated December 10, 1863. The letter, preserved in the Weatherby family papers at the University of Georgia, states, "Last night, at an hour approaching midnight, both myself and my wife were startled, awake by the most dreadful sounds emanating from the direction of the Crane property. It began as a low metallic grinding, growing in intensity until it resembled nothing so much as screaming, though not of human origin. My wife insisted it was chains, that she could distinguish the specific sound of chains being dragged and pulled with great force. The sound lasted several minutes, then ceased. We heard Crane's dogs barking frantically afterward. I planned to inquire with Crane about what industrial process he might be conducting at such hours. But when Weatherby did inquire, Crane denied that anything unusual was occurring. He claimed his overseer was conducting late-night security checks, testing the restraints in the basement. This explanation satisfied no one, but in a society where a man's authority over his property was absolute, there was little anyone could do or would do. The incidents escalated. On December 11th, 3 separate households within a mile of the Crane plantation reported hearing the sounds. A Methodist minister named Reverend Samuel Blackwood documented in his diary that he was awakened by a chorus of metallic voices, anguished and angry, rising and falling in waves. When he went outside to investigate, he saw lights moving in the windows of the Crane plantation main house, but could determine nothing more from his distance. Inside the Crane household, terror was taking hold. Martha Green, a free black woman who worked as a cook in the main house and whose testimony was recorded in 1898 by a historian from Atlanta, described what she witnessed during those nights. Mr. Crane became a man possessed. On the 11th, after the sounds came again, I saw him go down to the basement with a lantern and a whip. I heard him shouting, heard the crack of leather, heard men crying out. But then came that sound again, that terrible metal sound, and Mr. Crane came running up the stairs, his face white as death. He was shaking so badly he could barely speak. He told me to pack my things and leave the property immediately, but I had nowhere to go, so I hid in the kitchen house. What was Crane discovering in that basement? His personal journal, fragments of which were recovered after his death, contains entries from this period that grow increasingly disturbed. An entry dated December 12th reads, "The chains move. I have seen it with my own eyes. When no hand touches them, they move. They contract and expand as if breathing. The slaves claim ignorance, but I know they are responsible somehow. I will not be driven from my own home by their African witchcraft. Tomorrow night I will stay in the basement myself. I will witness the truth of this deception." But Crane did not carry out this plan. Instead, on December 13th, he made a different decision. He dismissed his overseer, sending Jeremiah Holt away from the property with immediate effect. He gave no explanation, but Holt's final journal entry from the Crane plantation suggests what might have motivated this. Mr. Crane has descended into madness. He speaks of the chains as if they are alive, as if they have consciousness and intent. He claims he sees figures in the basement when no one is there, shadows that move between the chained men, touching the restraints, whispering in voices like grinding metal. I believe he intends to do something terrible tonight. I have taken my belongings and departed. May God have mercy on whatever occurs in that house. This brings us to December 14th, 1863, the final night, the night when whatever had been building in that basement would finally reach its culmination. We know that Crane chained Samuel and 5 others in the basement that evening. We know that Crane himself was seen by Martha Green at approximately 7 in the evening, drinking heavily in his study, staring at a revolver he had placed on his desk. We know that sometime before midnight, Crane descended into the basement, carrying the revolver and a lantern, and we know that at midnight exactly, according to multiple testimonies from surrounding properties, the sounds began again, but this time with an intensity that dwarfed all previous incidents. Tell me in the comments what you think is happening so far. Is this a case of mass hysteria, collective delusion born from the tensions of war and the guilt of slavery? Is it a carefully orchestrated revenge plot with Samuel and others manipulating Crane's fears? Or is it something else? Something that emerged from the suffering absorbed by those chains, a supernatural force born from accumulated pain? Hold that thought, because what happened next would challenge every rational explanation. The testimony of Martha Green, recorded 35 years after the events, provides our most detailed account of the sounds that emanated from the Crane plantation on the night of December 14th, 1863. At midnight, the house itself seemed to shudder. The sound that rose from the basement was like nothing of this earth. It was metal screaming, yes, but there were voices within the metal, human voices mixed with something else. I could hear Mr. Crane shouting, hear him firing his revolver, the shots echoing through the floorboards. Then the metal sounds grew louder, drowning out everything else. Marcus Weatherby, in a statement given to the county sheriff on December 16th, described the sounds as carrying across the fields to his property nearly a mile away. It was as if every chain in hell had been pulled taut at once, then released to crash against stone. The sound came in waves, building to peaks that hurt the ears, then falling to a low grinding that was somehow worse. My wife fainted from the terror of it. It lasted, by my pocket watch, for 11 minutes. Reverend Blackwood, who had gone to bed early that evening, documented that he was awakened by his windows rattling in their frames, despite no wind. When he went outside, he could see other neighbors emerging from their homes, all looking toward the Crane property. In the moonlight, they could see the plantation house, lights blazing in every window, and from within, that terrible cacophony of tortured metal. But here is where the testimonies become strange in a different way. Multiple witnesses report that between the metallic sounds, they could hear words. Not clearly, not anything that could be transcribed, but the suggestion of speech, of communication, as if the chains themselves were forming. Language. A farmer named Tobias Reed stated in his testimony, "I swear before God those chains were speaking. I could not make out words, but there was rhythm, there was pattern. It sounded like a trial, like accusations being made and judgment being passed. At approximately 12 minutes past midnight, the sound stopped. The abrupt silence was described by multiple witnesses as being worse than the noise, a cessation so complete it seemed to vacuum all sound from the world. The lights in the crane house went dark. The night became absolutely still. No one approached the house that night. Even the bravest of neighbors, even Reverend Blackwood, stayed away. There was a collective understanding that something had concluded, something final and terrible, and that whatever remained in that house was best left undisturbed until daylight. Dawn came at approximately 6:45 on the morning of December 15th. Marcus Weatherby, accompanied by Reverend Blackwood and 2 other men, approached the Crane plantation as the sun rose over the pine forests. The main house stood silent. The front door was hanging open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. The windows on the ground floor were shattered from the inside, as if something had struck them with great force. Glass littered the porch. The men called out for Elijah Crane. There was no response. They called for the overseer, forgetting that Holt had been dismissed 2 days prior. They called for anyone at all. The plantation was silent as a tomb. They entered the main house carefully. The interior was in a state of disarray that suggested violence. Furniture was overturned. Papers were scattered across the floor of the study. Crane's revolver lay on the stairs leading to the basement. 3 of its 6 chambers fired, the weapon still reeking of powder. Reverend Blackwood later wrote in his journal, "We found the basement door standing open. A cold draft came up from below, carrying an odor I cannot adequately describe. It was metal and stone and something organic, something wrong. We stood at the top of those stairs for several minutes, none of us willing to descend. Finally, I took a lantern and went down. The others followed." What they found in that basement became the subject of official inquiry, medical examination, and decades of speculation. The scene was documented by County Sheriff William Harding in a report dated December 17, 1863. The 6 individuals who had been chained in the basement were found alive, conscious, and unharmed. The chains that had held them were open, lying on the ground, the lock still engaged, but somehow separated from the restraints. According to the report, this should have been physically impossible without keys or tools. The chains appeared to have opened from within. Samuel was gone. There was no sign of him. The restraints that should have held him dangled empty from the wall. And Elijah Crane was found dead at the center of the basement floor. The position of his body was documented in detail by Dr. Ambrose Fletcher, the physician who examined the scene. Crane lay on his back, his arms extended, his legs straight. His clothing was torn, his eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, his expression described by Fletcher as beyond fear, approaching a state of understanding or acceptance of something terrible. But it was the wounds on Crane's body that defied explanation. Fletcher's report, preserved in the county medical records, describes them with clinical precision. The deceased shows marks upon wrists, ankles, neck, and torso, consistent with restraint by metal implements. The marks are deep, suggesting prolonged and forceful application. However, the pattern of these marks is inconsistent with any restraint applied by external force. They appear instead as if the restraints grew from within the flesh outward, or as if the flesh was pulled inward to meet restraints that materialized around it. I have never seen anything similar in 30 years of medical practice. There were no chains on or near Crane's body. The restraints that had held the 6 enslaved individuals remained on the walls where they had always been. Yet Crane bore the unmistakable marks of having been chained, and the depth and severity of the wounds suggested hours of application. Dr. Fletcher estimated time of death at approximately 12:15 on the morning of December 15th, roughly 15 minutes after the sounds had stopped. The official cause of death was recorded as heart failure brought on by unknown circumstances. The 6 individuals who had been in the basement that night were questioned separately by Sheriff Harding. Their testimonies were recorded and sealed, not to be opened for 50 years per the sheriff's orders. When the documents were finally accessed in 1913, historians found accounts that were consistent with each other, yet maddeningly vague about specifics. Isaac, one of the chained men, stated, "We were locked down same as every night. Mr. Crane came down around midnight angry, waving his gun. He was shouting at Samuel, calling him witchcraft, calling him demon. Then the chains started moving. Not us moving them moving on their own. Mr. Crane fired his gun 3 times, but he wasn't shooting at any of us. He was shooting at the chains themselves. Then something happened I can't rightly explain. The chains came off us. All at once they just opened. And Samuel, he stood up and he walked to where Mr. Crane was standing. But Samuel didn't touch him. Samuel just spoke words I didn't understand. Old words, words in a language I never heard, and the chains that wasn't on us anymore, they went to Mr. Crane. They moved through the air like snakes, and Mr. Crane, he just stood there, like he couldn't move, like he was already caught. Then Samuel walked up the stairs and out, and we sat there until morning, afraid to move, afraid to go near Mr. Crane, who was on the floor by then, not breathing. Clara, one of the women, provided a similar but distinct account. The chains screamed. That's what people heard. The chains were screaming. All the pain that went through them chains, all the people who'd been locked in them, all that suffering, it came out as sound. And when they screamed loud enough, they broke. Not broke like metal breaking, but broke free, like they decided they was done holding slaves and they was going to hold a master instead. Samuel didn't do nothing to Mr. Crane directly. The chains did it. Samuel just called them somehow, like he'd learned their language. The most disturbing testimony came from a man named Thomas, who stated, Mr. Crane knew. At the end, when the chains came for him, he knew. He didn't fight. He let them take him. I saw his face. He looked relieved, like he'd been waiting for this, like he knew it was owed. The chains wrapped around him gentle, almost tender. Then they tightened and tightened, and he died with his eyes open watching Samuel walk away. But here is the critical question that the testimonies could not answer. What actually happened? Were these 6 traumatized individuals reporting events accurately, or had they constructed a shared narrative to explain something they'd done themselves? Was Samuel a murderer who had found a way to kill his tormentor and stage it to look supernatural? Had he unlocked the chains somehow, killed Crane in a struggle, then inflicted the post-mortem wounds to suggest supernatural causation? Sheriff Harding clearly believed the latter. His private notes, discovered among his personal papers after his death in 1891, include this assessment. The Negroes murdered Crane and fabricated an absurd story to avoid punishment. However, given the circumstances of the war, the imminent collapse of the institution of slavery, and the impossibility of prosecuting the case without further inflaming local tensions, I have chosen to record the death as resulting from unknown causes and to let the matter rest. But Harding could not explain the physical evidence. He could not explain how the chains had been opened without keys. He could not explain the nature of Crane's wounds, and he could not explain where Samuel had gone. In the days following Crane's death, a search was conducted for Samuel. Confederate authorities, what remained of them in the chaos of late 1863, placed a substantial reward for his capture. They searched the surrounding forests, questioned enslaved populations on neighboring plantations, sent descriptions to Confederate outposts throughout the state. Samuel was never found. Years later, rumors would surface. A man matching Samuel's description was supposedly seen in Tennessee in 1865, working as a freedman on a farm. Another report placed him in Ohio in 1870, working as a carpenter under a different name. A third claim, from 1880, suggested he had gone west, disappearing into the territories where records were sparse and a man could remake himself entirely, but none of these sightings were ever confirmed. Samuel, like the truth of what happened in that basement, vanished into the uncertain spaces of history. The Crane plantation was abandoned immediately after the incident. The enslaved population was dispersed to other properties in the chaos that followed. The main house stood empty. No one wanted to purchase it. No one wanted to live there. Martha Green, in her 1898 testimony, provided one final detail that has haunted researchers ever since. About a week after Mr. Crane died, I went back to the plantation to collect some things I'd left behind. I went down to the basement. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe. The chains were still there on the walls, but they was different. They was twisted, like they'd been wrung out like wet cloth, even though they was iron, and carved into the stone wall, in letters that looked burned in, were words. I couldn't read all of them, but I remember one phrase, "The chains remember." I left quick after that, never went back. This carving was never officially documented. By the time historians began investigating the site in the early 1900s, the basement had partially collapsed, and no trace of the supposed message could be found. The story of the Crane plantation might have faded entirely into local folklore, remembered only as a ghost story told to frightened children, if not for a series of discoveries and incidents that occurred in the decades following the Civil War. In 1889, 26 years after Crane's death, a businessman named Robert Kinsey purchased the abandoned plantation with plans to renovate the main house and convert the property into a lumber operation. Kinsey was from Chicago, unaware of the property's history, attracted solely by the cheap price and the valuable timber on the land. Construction crews began work in October of 1889. According to an article in the Macon Telegraph dated November 12, 1889, the workers refused to continue after only 3 days. The article states, "The renovation project at the old Crane estate has been abandoned due to what workers describe as unnatural disturbances." Foreman James Mitchell reported that tools would go missing, only to be found in the basement arranged in patterns. Workers reported hearing sounds of chains from within the walls, despite no chains being present. One worker claims to have seen the figure of a black man standing in the basement doorway at dusk, watching them, before vanishing when approached. Mr. Kinsey has withdrawn from the project and placed the property back on the market. Kinsey sold the property at a loss and returned to Chicago. The plantation remained abandoned for another decade. In 1901, a professor of folklore from the University of Georgia named Dr. Harrison Pritchard conducted an extensive study of Southern ghost stories and legends. His research brought him to Wilkinson County, where he collected testimonies about the Crane plantation from elderly residents who remembered the events of 1863. Dr. Pritchard's unpublished manuscript, housed in the university archives, contains interviews with 17 different individuals. Among them was a woman named Patience, who had been 13 years old in 1863 and had lived on a neighboring plantation. Her testimony, recorded in 1901 when she was 51, provides details that don't appear in any official documents. Samuel was special. Everybody knew it. He could do things others couldn't. He could look at a broken tool and know how to fix it without being taught. He could predict when storms was coming days ahead. Some said his grandmother was a root woman from Africa, that she'd taught him things before she died. After his wife and daughter was killed, he spent nights in the quarters speaking words none of us knew, words that sounded old, words that felt heavy when he said them. He was calling something. We all knew it. We was afraid of it and hopeful about it at the same time. This testimony is important because it introduces an element largely absent from the official records. The suggestion that Samuel had specific knowledge or abilities related to spiritual practices that may have been brought from Africa and preserved in secret among enslaved populations. Dr. Pritchard took this seriously enough to investigate further. He found references in other testimonies to root work and conjuring in the slave quarters of multiple plantations in the area. He documented a tradition of spiritual resistance of enslaved people maintaining African religious practices and beliefs despite brutal suppression. And he theorized that what happened in the Crane basement might have been a convergence of genuine spiritual practice, psychological trauma, and circumstances that created what he called a perfect storm of belief manifesting as reality. In 1918, 15 years after Dr. Pritchard's research, the property changed hands once more. A veteran of the Great War named Marcus Tolliver purchased it with a federal loan designed to help returning soldiers. Tolliver was skeptical of ghost stories, dismissive of superstition, determined to make something of the land. He lasted 6 months. Tolliver's diary, donated to the Georgia Historical Society by his granddaughter in 1995, chronicles a gradual descent into obsession and fear. The entries begin rationally enough, discussing repair work and agricultural plans. But by January of 1919, the tone changes dramatically. January 14th, 1919, I have heard the chains. I thought the locals were playing tricks, but there is no one here but me. At night, from the basement, I hear them moving, dragging across stone. I have gone down 3 times to investigate. There are no chains in that basement. I removed them all when I arrived, yet I hear them clearly. Last night I heard voices within the sound of the chains, whispering, accusing. I cannot make out words, but I understand the meaning. Guilt, judgment, I have done nothing wrong, yet I feel accused. February 2nd, 1919. I saw him last night. A black man standing at the edge of the property, watching the house. When I approached with a lantern, he was gone. I found footprints leading to the basement window, then nothing. No tracks leading away. I am beginning to understand why this place was abandoned. February 20th, 1919. I am leaving tomorrow. I will take a loss on the property. I do not care. Something is wrong here at a fundamental level. The chains have not been present in this basement for 55 years, yet I can feel them. I can feel the weight of them, the cold of them, the suffering that soaked into them. This morning I woke with marks on my wrists, faint but visible, as if I had been restrained during the night. I was alone. The door was locked from the inside. I will not spend another night here. Tolliver abandoned the property in February of 1919 and moved to Atlanta. The land reverted to the county for unpaid taxes. In 1952, a different kind of investigator arrived. Dr. Evelyn Marsh, a psychologist from Emory University with an interest in what she called trauma imprints, conducted a study of locations associated with historical atrocities. The Crane plantation was among her research sites. Dr. Marsh's methodology was unusual for its time. She brought with her sensitive recording equipment, cameras, and several volunteer participants who claimed to have psychic abilities. Her published paper, Residual Phenomena at Sites of Historical Trauma, Journal of Parapsychology, 1953, includes findings from the Crane plantation that remain controversial. According to Marsh's report, her team experienced consistent auditory phenomena between the hours of 11:45 p.m. and 12:15 a.m. on 3 consecutive nights. Her recording equipment allegedly captured sounds that resembled chains moving across stone, though analysis could not rule out natural explanations. More intriguingly, one of her photosensitive participants, a woman named Helen Corso, reported experiencing what she described as overwhelming sensory impressions when entering the collapsed basement. Corso's written testimony, included in Marsh's paper, states, "I felt the presence of multiple individuals experiencing simultaneous terror and rage. The strongest presence was male, characterized by an emotion I can only describe as righteous fury held under impossible restraint for years, then released all at once. I received impressions of chains, but the chains were alive, they were conscious, they were hungry for justice. I also received the impression of a specific individual, the source of the fury, a man who had learned to speak to objects, to imbue them with purpose through the intensity of his suffering and will. The name Samuel came to me, though I had no prior knowledge of the history." Skeptics dismissed Marsh's work as pseudoscience. Believers saw it as confirmation of supernatural phenomena. The truth, as always, remained elusive. The most recent investigation occurred in 1987, conducted by a team from the American Society for Psychical Research. They found the basement completely collapsed, the main house reduced to partial walls and rubble. Using ground-penetrating radar, they identified what appeared to be metal objects buried beneath the collapsed basement, likely the original chains. They did not excavate. The property owner, whose identity was kept confidential, refused permission, but the radar images included in the team's report showed 12 distinct metallic objects in a pattern that matches the description of where the chains were originally mounted on the walls. In 2003, a local historian named Patricia Summerfield published a book titled Chains of Memory, Slavery, Vengeance, and the Supernatural in Civil War Georgia. The book dedicated 3 chapters to the Crane Plantation, compiling all available documentation and testimonies. Summerfield interviewed descendants of enslaved people from the area, collecting oral histories that had been passed down through families. One testimony, from a man named Joseph Green, great-great-grandson of Martha Green, included a family story that had never been publicly shared. "My great-great-grandmother told my great-grandmother, and she told my grandmother, and she told my mother, and she told me, Samuel didn't die. He walked out of that basement and he kept walking. He walked all the way to freedom, but he left something behind in those chains. He left his pain, his wife's pain, his daughter's pain, all of it. He poured it into that metal and it stayed there, waiting. That's why people still hear the chains, because the pain is still there. Pain like that doesn't just go away. It echoes." This concept of pain as a persistent force, almost a living entity, appears in multiple testimonies collected by Summerfield. It suggests a folk understanding of trauma that predates modern psychological concepts, the idea that suffering can imprint itself on physical objects and locations, creating echoes that persist across time. The Crane Plantation property remains privately owned as of 2024. It has never been successfully developed. The ruins of the main house have been gradually reclaimed by forest. Local teenagers occasionally dare each other to visit at night, reporting experiences ranging from nothing unusual to profound unease, to claims of seeing figures and hearing sounds. Whether these modern reports reflect anything genuine or are simply the product of suggestion and expectation is impossible to determine. But the consistency of the reports across more than 160 years suggests something remarkable, whether psychological, supernatural, or a combination of both. The chains themselves, if they still exist buried beneath the collapsed basement, have not been examined by modern forensic methods. What secrets they might reveal about metallurgy, about wear patterns, about the chemical traces of the humans they restrained, remains unknown. But perhaps some things are better left buried. Perhaps some objects have absorbed enough suffering that they should not be disturbed. Perhaps the chains that screamed at midnight in 1863 should be allowed to rest in their grave of stone and earth, their terrible purpose fulfilled, their voice finally silenced. Or perhaps they are not silent at all. Perhaps they are simply waiting, as they waited before, for the right moment, the right circumstances, the right alignment of rage and justice to give them voice once more. We have reached the end of our journey into one of the darkest and most disturbing episodes in American history, a story where the documented horrors of slavery intersect with events that challenge our understanding of reality itself. What really happened in the basement of the Crane Plantation on the night of December 14th, 1863? After examining all the available evidence, all the testimonies, all the investigations conducted over more than 160 years, we are left with three primary theories, none of which can be definitively proven or disproven. The first theory is the rational explanation. Samuel, driven beyond endurance by the murder of his wife and daughter, planned and executed an elaborate revenge against Elijah Crane. According to this theory, Samuel had help from others in the slave quarters, people who created the sounds and phenomena that terrorized Crane in the days leading up to his death. On the night of December 14th, they somehow gained access to keys or lock-picking tools, freed themselves, killed Crane in a manner designed to look supernatural, then fled. The wounds on Crane's body, the open chains, the testimonies about chains moving on their own were all carefully staged to create a supernatural narrative that would protect the real perpetrators from prosecution. This theory is supported by the fact that Samuel was never found, suggesting successful escape and planning. It's supported by the chaotic circumstances of late 1863, when normal law enforcement was severely disrupted by the war. It's supported by our modern understanding that supernatural events do not occur, that there must be rational explanations for all phenomena. But this theory struggles to explain certain details. How were the chains opened without keys, without marks of forced entry on the locks? How did 6 different people, questioned separately, provide consistent testimonies about events they claimed to witness? How did Crane acquire wounds that a trained physician described as impossible to inflict by normal means? And most significantly, why would Samuel and others create such an elaborate scheme when simpler methods of escape or revenge would have sufficed? The second theory is the supernatural explanation. Samuel, whether through African spiritual practices preserved in his family, through the intensity of his suffering, or through some other means, somehow called forth a genuine supernatural force. According to this theory, the chains, after years of causing suffering, absorbed that suffering and became something more than inanimate objects. On the night of December 14th, Samuel's rage and grief reached a critical mass. The chains responded, and they executed judgment on Elijah Crane according to a justice older and darker than human law. This theory is supported by the consistency of testimony across time, by the reports of phenomena experienced by people with no knowledge of the history, by the persistent reports from the site across 160 years. It's supported by the physical evidence that seems to defy rational explanation. It's supported by our knowledge that enslaved Africans did maintain spiritual practices that white society neither understood nor documented. But this theory requires us to accept the existence of supernatural forces, requires us to believe that objects can become conscious, that suffering can manifest as tangible power. For many, this is simply too large an assumption to make. The third theory, and perhaps the most disturbing, is that both explanations are partially true. Samuel did plan revenge, but in doing so, he tapped into something real, something that exists in the uncertain spaces between psychology and the supernatural. Perhaps intense belief, combined with the right circumstances, can create effects that are genuinely real without being supernatural in a traditional sense. Perhaps the chains did move, not because they were magically animated, but because the accumulated trauma, belief, and intention of dozens of people over years created a psychological field so intense it could affect physical reality. This theory suggests that the boundary between mind and matter is more permeable than we typically believe, that consciousness under extreme circumstances can do things we don't yet understand. It's the least comfortable theory, because it doesn't resolve into either pure rationality or pure supernaturalism. It leaves us in uncertainty, and perhaps uncertainty is exactly where this story should end. To this day, no one knows the truth of what happened in that basement. Elijah Crane is dead, his crimes buried with him. Samuel is gone, vanished into history, whether into freedom or into legend we cannot say. The chains, if they still exist, lie buried beneath stone and earth and 160 years of silence. But the story persists. It persists because it touches something deep in us, something that demands justice even when earthly systems fail to provide it, something that wants to believe that suffering is not meaningless, that pain leaves a mark on the world, that those who cause such pain will ultimately answer for it, whether to human law, divine judgment, or something else entirely. The chains that screamed at midnight remind us that history has weight, that trauma echoes, that some debts come due in unexpected ways. Whether those chains were moved by human hands, supernatural forces, or something in between, their message remains the same. Cruelty leaves marks that do not fade. Suffering demands recognition, and justice, denied long enough, will find its own path. Thank you for staying with me through this dark journey into America's past. If you found this story compelling, if it made you think, if it disturbed you in ways you're still processing, I invite you to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. Join our community of those who seek truth in the darkness, who are willing to confront uncomfortable history, who understand that the past is never truly past. I want to hear from you in the comments. What do you believe happened in that basement? Do you think Samuel murdered Crane and staged a supernatural event? Do you believe genuine supernatural forces were at work? Or do you think something else entirely occurred, something we haven't yet considered? Share your theories, share your thoughts, share stories from your own regions about places where history refuses to stay buried. Remember, we are a community here. We explore these dark corners of history together. We question together. We seek understanding together. Your voice matters. Your perspective adds to our collective search for truth. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, stay open to possibilities. There are more stories waiting in the shadows, more forgotten histories demanding to be told, more mysteries that refuse to remain buried. The chains may have stopped screaming in 1863, or they may be screaming still, too quietly for most to hear. Listen carefully. History has many voices, and not all of them speak in words. This has been the story of the chains that screamed at midnight. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about these difficult, disturbing, necessary stories. And remember, every chain that ever bound a human being screamed, whether anyone heard it or not. Until we meet again in the next episode, take care of yourselves and each other. Goodbye.